I love him. I miss him. There's nothing I wouldn't do to bring him back.
April 15, 2019, started like any other day in Crystal Lake, Illinois. But for 5-year-old AJ Frowned, it would be his last. When his father, Andrew Freund, called 911 in the early hours of that morning, it seemed like a routine report of a missing child. AJ had vanished from his own home. The frantic search for a young boy in the quiet, suburban neighborhood quickly turned into something far darker than anyone could have imagined. What was supposed to be a heart-wrenching case of a child lost in the night became a chilling investigation into the lives of the people who should have protected him the most. His parents. The questions grew louder. How could a child so young simply disappear? Was AJ's disappearance the work of a stranger, or was the danger closer than anyone realized? Andrew's calm demeanor as he spoke with the 911 dispatcher didn't sit right with investigators. His story didn't add up. Where was AJ? And why did the parents seem oddly distant as the search intensified? The home where AJ had lived was anything but ordinary. Garbage, clutter, and neglect painted a picture of a family struggling with its own dark secrets. As the hours turned into days, investigators began to connect the dots, and soon they discovered the most unsettling fact. This wasn't just about a missing child. It was about betrayal. It was about a case that would reveal the unimaginable. Parents who were supposed to protect their child, but instead became the focus of an investigation that would uncover shocking truths. The deeper they looked, the more they realized. Sometimes the greatest danger comes from those closest to you. On the morning of April 15, 2019, Crystal Lake, Illinois, was shaken by the sudden disappearance of 5-year-old AJ Frowned. His father, Andrew Freund, called 911, claiming that his son had vanished from their home sometime after he put him to bed the previous evening. The scene seemed typical of a missing child case, one all too familiar to law enforcement. Yet as they arrived at the Cunningham home, investigators began noticing discrepancies in Andrew's story. The house was in disarray, clutter, garbage, and signs of neglect were apparent throughout. But the most unsettling part was the apparent calm of the parents. The initial search quickly spread across the neighborhood, but there were no signs of AJ. Despite their best efforts, AJ remained missing, and the investigation began to take an unexpected turn. What seemed like a simple missing child case soon revealed something far more troubling. As hours passed, detectives noticed inconsistencies in Andrew's account of the events. He claimed that he last saw AJ around 9 p.m. the previous night, but no one could verify that AJ had gone to bed at that time. Further, neighbors didn't hear any signs of distress, and there were no unusual calls made from the house in the lead-up to AJ's disappearance. At first it seemed like AJ had simply wandered off, or perhaps was abducted. But as the investigation progressed, it became increasingly clear that something darker was at play. What was hidden beneath the surface of this suburban home? What had happened to AJ, and who was responsible? The truth was out there, but it was more complicated, and far more disturbing, than anyone could have imagined. AJ Frowned was a bright, curious 5-year-old boy, full of energy and wonder. To those who knew him, he was a child who radiated life, a young boy with a promising future ahead. He loved playing outdoors, and his bright smile was enough to light up any room. But behind that smile, AJ's life was far from the fairy tale it seemed. His family life was marked by years of instability, neglect, and struggles that no child should have to endure. AJ's mother, Joanne Cunningham, had a long history of substance abuse, a cycle that had been an ever-present part of her life for years. As a result, AJ, along with his siblings, spent a significant portion of his early years in foster care. Over time, Joanne's struggles with addiction led to her losing custody of her children, and they were placed under the care of the Illinois Department of Children and Family Services, DCFS. But Joanne's story of recovery was far from straightforward. In 2015, after completing a rehabilitation program, Joanne and her partner, Andrew Freund Sr., regained custody of AJ. The state believed that Joanne had overcome her addiction and that the family was ready to have AJ back under their roof. However, the process of regaining custody did not mean the end of the family's struggles. Despite appearances, the family was still grappling with a history of dysfunction that would never fully be addressed. Andrew Freund Sr., AJ's father, had his own set of issues. Though not as publicly known for his substance abuse as Joanne, Andrew's past was marked by instability. A man with a criminal history and a pattern of poor decisions, Andrew's presence in AJ's life was not a stabilizing factor. Though he was not absent, his role as a father remained somewhat passive, with his actions often overshadowed by his own struggles. The couple's attempt to rebuild their lives came after the trauma of years of neglect and instability. In 2016, AJ was returned to their custody under the assumption that the parents had turned a new leaf. However, this was far from the truth. Over the next few years, signs of neglect continued to surface, though they were often overlooked. Despite reports to DCFS and several investigations into the Cunningham household, no concrete actions were taken. In 2018, a disturbing tip came to the authorities. A neighbor reported that Andrew and Joanne were housing a heroin addict. Yet, the department failed to intervene, allowing AJ and his younger sibling to remain in the home. The dysfunction within the family was clear, but no one had taken the necessary steps to address it properly. In December 2018, AJ was found with bruises on his body, and his mother's erratic behavior, passing out in her car, were clear signs that the situation had once again spiraled out of control. Still, AJ remained with his parents. The reports continued to pile up, but the interventions were few and far between. AJ's safety was no longer just in question, it was in imminent danger. The family's history with DCFS was long and fraught with missed opportunities for intervention. Despite multiple warnings, the system failed to protect AJ from the very people who were supposed to care for him. Joanne's ongoing struggle with substance abuse, coupled with Andrew's absence of a stabilizing influence, left AJ vulnerable in ways that no child should ever be. As the years passed, it seemed as though AJ's safety was continuously jeopardized, but each time the family was allowed to remain together. The system had failed him before, but this time, it would lead to an irreversible tragedy. This failure to act, despite numerous warnings, would later become a focal point of the investigation into AJ's death, a death that could have been prevented had the warning signs been taken seriously. On the morning of April 15, 2019, Andrew Freund Sr. dialed 911. His voice was steady, but the panic beneath it was palpable. He told the dispatcher that he couldn't find his 5-year-old son AJ. The last time he saw him was the night before, just before putting him to bed. AJ had vanished without a trace from their home in Crystal Lake, Illinois. The authorities arrived, and what initially appeared to be a routine missing child case quickly turned into something much more troubling. The investigators who arrived at the Cunningham home were immediately struck by the disarray. The house was in a dilapidated state, garbage scattered across the floors, furniture broken, and signs of neglect throughout the property. It was clear that this wasn't just a typical family home. There were troubling signs that spoke volumes about the environment in which AJ had been living, but the most unsettling part was the eerie calm of his parents. As the search for AJ unfolded, the inconsistencies in Andrew Freund Sr.'s statements raised red flags. He claimed he last saw AJ at 9 p.m., but no one could confirm that AJ had actually gone to bed. Neighbors, who would have noticed something unusual, reported nothing out of the ordinary. The timeline didn't add up. Police began to wonder, if AJ hadn't wandered off, where could he have gone? It didn't take long for investigators to shift their focus. The case, which initially seemed like a simple missing child investigation, was becoming more complex with each passing hour. The questions multiplied. Had AJ been taken? Was there a deeper, more sinister reason for his disappearance? As the hours turned into days, the investigation started to move away from the search for a missing child to the far more chilling reality of a potential crime scene. The parents, once the victims in the eyes of the community, were now under scrutiny. The investigation was no longer about finding AJ, it was about uncovering the dark truth of what had happened to him. The shift was subtle, but it was undeniable. What started as a search for a missing boy was now turning into a complex investigation into suspicious circumstances, with the focus turning on the people who should have been protecting him. The chilling possibility of foul play began to surface. The investigation into AJ Fround's disappearance began with a traditional search. Officers scoured the area around the Cunningham home, canvassing the neighborhood for any leads. However, as time passed and the search yielded no sign of AJ, investigators began to notice unsettling inconsistencies in Andrew Freund's statements. His calmness, his lack of urgency, things didn't add up. The more they dug into the family's past, the more troubling details began to surface. AJ's body was discovered on April 24, 2019, almost 10 days after his disappearance. The location was chillingly close to the Cunningham home, just 10 miles away in a rural area of Woodstock, Illinois. AJ's body was buried in a shallow grave, wrapped in plastic and covered with hay. The discovery confirmed what investigators had feared: the little boy was dead. What had initially seemed like an ordinary missing person case had quickly turned into a tragic murder investigation. Forensic evidence soon played a pivotal role in uncovering the truth. The autopsy revealed that AJ had suffered multiple blunt force injuries, likely the cause of his death. The report indicated significant trauma to his head and torso. Despite the absence of external signs of injury that could have led to immediate suspicion, the deep tissue damage spoke volumes about the severity of the abuse AJ had endured. As investigators continued their work, Andrew Freund's conflicting statements raised suspicion. He had initially claimed that he couldn't find AJ after putting him to bed the night before, but forensic evidence told a different story. He had repeatedly failed to mention certain critical details, and his behavior was becoming increasingly difficult to explain. Beyond his inconsistent statements, other key pieces of evidence began to emerge. Authorities discovered that Andrew had conducted several internet searches in the hours following AJ's disappearance. The searches were disturbing. They included terms related to child CPR, as well as items that would later be found in the Cunningham home: duct tape, bleach, and other cleaning supplies. These items, seemingly innocent at first glance, took on a much darker context when linked to the timeline of AJ's death. The deeper investigators went, the more they uncovered. In addition to the search history, the condition of the family's home spoke volumes. Items like duct tape, plastic bags, and bleach were found in places that seemed inconspicuous at first but were later tied to AJ's death and subsequent concealment. The lack of visible panic or urgency from Andrew suggested a deliberate attempt to conceal the truth from investigators. One of the most striking revelations came from a detailed forensic investigation. The experts pieced together the exact nature of AJ's injuries and connected the dots between the evidence found at the scene and the parents' actions. It became increasingly clear that AJ's death was not accidental. He had been subjected to brutal treatment in the days leading up to his death, and the deliberate concealment of his body pointed to an attempt to cover up the crime. Meanwhile, the systemic failures that allowed AJ's tragic fate to unfold began to come into focus. Despite multiple reports from neighbors, DCFS had failed to take effective action to remove AJ from the home before his death. The family had a long history with Child Protective Services, yet those in positions of responsibility failed to act on the warning signs that AJ was at risk. Even after incidents of abuse were reported, AJ remained in the household, and no substantial intervention was made. The investigation revealed a damning reality. Systemic failures, both by law enforcement and social services, had allowed a child to remain in an unsafe environment. The deep cracks in the system that failed to protect AJ would come under heavy scrutiny in the aftermath of his death. Those closest to AJ and the community were left to ask why no one had intervened in time to save him. As the investigation advanced, it became clear that this was no ordinary case. Every piece of evidence, from forensic findings to the search history, painted a picture of a child whose life was tragically and violently cut short. The mounting evidence pointed directly to the parents who were supposed to protect him, turning this case into one of the most devastating betrayals of trust. Each new detail added to the mystery of AJ's life and death. The key evidence found at the scene didn't just help build a case, it revealed the chilling truth of what had really happened to AJ, step by step. The question was no longer where AJ had gone, it was how his own family, the people who should have loved him the most, became the architects of his tragic end. The trial of Joanne Cunningham and Andrew Freund Sr. was a turning point in the case of AJ Fround's death. What had begun as a desperate search for a missing child slowly transformed into a legal battle where the true story of AJ's tragic fate was unveiled. The courtroom became the stage for a battle between the defense and prosecution, each side presenting their version of events, but all eyes remained fixed on the outcome. Joanne Cunningham, AJ's mother, faced first-degree murder charges. The prosecution laid out a compelling case, built on forensic evidence, Andrew's conflicting statements, and the disturbing discoveries made during the investigation. The details were clear. AJ had been subjected to violent abuse, and his death was no accident. Joanne, despite initially maintaining her innocence, ultimately pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. The decision shocked many, but it also signaled the grim reality of the case. The person who was supposed to nurture and protect AJ had been the one to end his life. The courtroom was tense as Joanne's plea was read. In the end, she was sentenced to 35 years in prison, a term that would keep her behind bars for the foreseeable future, though it did not come close to undoing the damage caused by her actions. Her family, her community, those who knew her, would now be left to grapple with the consequences of a choice that would haunt them forever. Andrew Freund Sr., AJ's father, also faced charges for his involvement in the death of his son. Although his role was somewhat different, The prosecution argued that Andrew had done nothing to intervene or protect AJ from the abuse he suffered. Andrew had initially claimed he was unaware of the severity of what was happening in his home, but the evidence told a different story. Andrew's actions, or lack thereof, were deemed negligent at best, and his role in the events that led to AJ's death could not be denied. Andrew pled guilty to involuntary manslaughter, acknowledging that while he didn't directly cause AJ's death, his failure to act contributed to the child's tragic end. The courtroom filled with a mix of emotions as the terms of the plea deal were read aloud. Andrew was sentenced to 30 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after serving 18 years. As both defendants were led away to begin serving their sentences, the impact of the verdict rippled through the community. Those who had followed the case closely couldn't help but feel the weight of the decisions that had led to this point. For AJ, justice had been served in some measure, but it came at a price. At the sentencing hearing, Joanne Cunningham offered a brief statement. She expressed regret for her actions, but it was clear that no words could bring AJ back. Her statement did little to ease the pain felt by those who had lost the bright young boy who had once been full of life and potential. For the family, friends, and the community, the verdicts served as a painful reminder of the dangers that can be hidden behind closed doors. The courtroom drama had ended, but the emotional scars left by AJ's death would linger for a long time. The impact of the verdict reverberated far beyond the courtroom. It forced a reckoning with a system that had failed to protect AJ and raised questions about how many others might still be at risk. In the years to come, the case would continue to serve as a reminder of the importance of vigilance in child protection and the need for stronger systems to safeguard children from harm. For the community of Crystal Lake, the trial was over, but the conversation about child safety and accountability would only just begin. The death of AJ Frowned was not just a tragedy for his family and friends. It was a glaring reflection of systemic failures within the child protection system. The Illinois Department of Children and Family Services, DCFS, had a long history of involvement with the Cunningham family. Yet despite multiple reports of neglect, abuse, and concerns about AJ's well-being, the agency failed to intervene in a timely manner. This wasn't the first time the Cunninghams had been under scrutiny. In fact, DCFS had been involved with the family for years. Multiple investigations had been opened and there had been various reports, some made by neighbors, others by concerned community members, about signs of neglect. But despite these concerns, AJ remained in the home. The system that was supposed to protect him had failed him time and again. When warnings were raised, action was delayed, and in some cases, it was simply ignored. As the details of AJ's death came to light, it became painfully clear that the very agency designed to safeguard children had overlooked key warning signs and failed to intervene effectively. DCFS was aware of the family's struggles, yet there was a lack of coordinated action to remove AJ from a dangerous environment. In fact, AJ's tragic death was one of the most significant failures in child protection in recent memory. Reports of substance abuse, emotional instability, and neglect were dismissed or not acted upon swiftly enough. The agency's inability to act decisively was a critical turning point, and the community would soon demand answers. The failure to act sooner had devastating consequences for AJ. The impact of this case reverberated beyond just AJ's immediate family. It struck at the heart of the community. Neighbors, friends, and even law enforcement felt the weight of the fact that a child had slipped through the cracks despite clear signs of neglect and harm. The community, once unified in its concern for AJ, now faced the painful reality that it had failed him. Many felt helpless, wondering if there was something they could have done to intervene earlier. In the wake of AJ's death, the calls for reform in child protection services grew louder. The public demanded better oversight of DCFS and more accountability for agencies that were responsible for safeguarding vulnerable children. Parents, educators, and child welfare advocates rallied together, calling for systemic changes to ensure that no other child would suffer the same fate as AJ. One of the most significant developments came in 2023, when charges were filed against two former DCFS workers, Carlos Acosta and Andrew Polovin. They were charged with reckless conduct and child endangerment due to their role in mishandling the case. The charges highlighted the deep-rooted issues within the agency and the failures of individuals responsible for ensuring children's safety. The community's anger reached a boiling point as they realized that negligence within the system had played a role in AJ's tragic death. The case also prompted legislative action. State lawmakers began to push for stronger oversight and accountability within child welfare services. The aim was clear: reform the system to prevent similar tragedies from occurring. New laws were proposed to improve the transparency and effectiveness of child protective services, ensuring that the mistakes made in AJ's case would not be repeated. For AJ's family, the community, and the state, the journey toward justice did not end with the verdicts handed down to Andrew and Joanne Cunningham. The ripple effects of this case would continue to shape conversations about child welfare, agency accountability, and the importance of protecting vulnerable children from harm. AJ's story, while a painful one, became a catalyst for change. His death sparked a movement toward reform, and his legacy would ultimately contribute to a broader discussion on how to protect future generations from similar tragedies. The community of Crystal Lake and the state of Illinois as a whole would forever carry the weight of AJ's life and death as a reminder of the systemic flaws that allowed his tragedy to unfold. AJ Fround's story is one that will forever haunt those who followed it, a tragic reminder of the failures within our child protection systems. From the very beginning there were warning signs, reports of neglect, disturbing behavior, and signs of distress from AJ. Yet, despite these repeated concerns, the system failed to intervene. A young boy, full of potential and life, was left vulnerable to the very people who should have protected him. As the investigation unfolded and the details of AJ's life and death came to light, the glaring flaws in the system were exposed. The fact that a child could slip through the cracks despite numerous reports to authorities is a failure we cannot ignore. AJ's death wasn't just the result of the actions of his parents. It was a direct consequence of a system that did not act swiftly or decisively enough to protect him. Please don't be the person who turns a blind eye. If you don't subscribe, comment below and tell us why you won't act. Is it because it doesn't matter to you or because it feels too overwhelming? No more excuses, your subscription could make a difference. This case reminds us of the critical importance of vigilance. The responsibility to protect children doesn't lie solely with agencies like DCFS. It's a shared duty. Neighbors, schools, communities, all of us need to be aware and proactive. We must ask ourselves, what can we do to prevent tragedies like AJ's from happening again? If you care about AJ's story and others like it, don't wait for someone else to take action. You have the power to raise awareness. Subscribe now and share the responsibility of making sure these stories are heard. The lessons from AJ's story are clear. It's up to us to demand better, to push for reforms, and to ensure that the failures of the past do not repeat themselves. Child protection is not just about laws and policies. It's about actively creating a culture where children are safe and valued, where their voices are heard, and where their lives are protected. If you've been moved by AJ's story and want to see more investigations into child safety and systemic failures, make sure to subscribe to our channel. We bring important stories to light, stories that need to be heard and acted upon. Don't forget to share this video to help raise awareness and comment below with your thoughts on the case and what reforms you think are needed to ensure better child protection in the future. Let's keep the conversation going and ensure that no more children fall through the cracks.